Guys, join our Twitter.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, hello.
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 Good day to you, sir.
Welcome to the time zone version of our Service Fabric Community Q&A 22. Oh, how did you say that? 22nd and a half?
22.5.
There you go.
It's a real number.
It's a 22nd and a half service fabric.
Yeah.
Welcome.
22 and a half.
So, as usual, we're here to answer your questions, give you some updates. Basically, whatever you folks want. You can drop questions in the IM window or just shout them out.
So, look at Vas.
We have at least 2 re-shows from this morning, or re-attendees or whatever.
Vaslav and Marcin.
Yep, welcome back.
Hey, Marcin, congratulations on your speed to the PR.
Yeah.
I think you have to explain that.
Oh, yes, sure.
Thank
So
you,
for
buddy.
those of you that may not know, we finally went open source yesterday, which is awesome. Great news. We're actually at the top of trending on GitHub today, which is also awesome.
Yeah.
But the reason I was congratulating Marcin is that he's the first non-Service Fabric team member to have actually submitted a PR that was merged from the external community. So he was the first thumbsucker, as we say. So super glad to have you guys be a part of our community. Looking forward to seeing what else you guys can contribute and continue to work with us in the future.
All right. So, questions.
All right.
What do we got?
It begins.
It begins. So,
I think Marcin has the first question.
sure. Let's see. Questions on KTL Logger and T-Store. Yeah, it doesn't.
He's had time to look closer at the
I
code.
know, he's looked at the code more. This is the downside of open source. So the log itself doesn't do any indexing on the things put inside of it, nor do the higher order key store stuff. The searches are basically handled via the comparators that you pass in when you actually iterate over the items in the list. Basically, there's not a lot of great support for additional queries or ordering or things like that in the API today. That's something that we're looking at enhancing. But yeah, you won't find much of that stuff. Basically, yeah, the KTL, the log is shared across all of the replicas, but there's also a shared log and a dedicated log. They're both KTL logs. So you have to look and see exactly which one is getting written into. Using unmanaged AB, one process can read KTL logger data from another process. If it's going to the shared log, then yes, technically, but I don't think we allow it. If going to dedicated log, no. And all system services using the same container, yeah, it would be the FM and the other things hosted inside of fabric.exe would be sharing one log. They shared ESE before, so it's not any different when we moved everything to the native log. But yeah, it is pretty much, it's designed to be shared because we built it originally for spinning media. So you want to put the write head down and just write forever. And so what it's really doing is it's muxing writes in from everywhere and trying to keep one big continuous stream of writes down so that you can write as efficiently as possible. Even with SSDs, there is performance benefits to not having just random writes all over the place. So having one big shared log is the optimal structure. It does make it look a little weird, and you can have more noisy neighbor type things. That's part of why the dedicated log exists, where you write everything kind of at first into the big shared log, and then you pull them out and give them their own view so that my reads are local and I don't have to mess with everybody else. I'm sure we'll talk more about this. We did talk this morning a little bit about how we want to write more papers and open source some of the papers that we've already written, patents we published, things like that, so that people can have a better sense of how all these things work. But yeah, in the meantime, you just kind of got to dig in and ask us.
Thank you so much. Now I seem to understand much better how it all works and why are some requests stupid. Like for example, requesting key values row or key value store, as the ordering is done by skip lists in the T store. It makes completely no sense now.
Yeah.
So it explains really, really, really a lot, and thanks for all the explanation.
No problem. Let's see. Who's next?
Andrew. Yes. Hi guys, glad to be here tonight. Thanks for taking the time. I've heard in prior Q&As and from docs that although possible and supported, cross data center region clusters can be challenging to configure. What is the best guidance if our organization is looking to do this? Is there a way to get more specific guidance on tackling this effort?
Yeah, so I'm going to link a couple of ARM templates that are examples of how to set that up. The hardest part is usually figuring out the networking, how you want to connect the networks in the multiple data centers together, and what the exact requirements around those things are. The other thing that can be tricky is getting a kind of single view of the cluster back. So Service Fabric Explorer will show you one cluster, but if you ever needed to phone up support and say, look at the logs now might be in 3 different data centers, and the logs being stuck in a data center won't help you if that's the data center that fails. You won't know what happened there because you won't be able to get the logs out. So on the other hand, if you start centralizing your logs in a 4th place or something like that, you're usually paying a lot in terms of network egress, in terms of bandwidth, or in terms of cost. That can be prohibitive. So it's more these operational things that are complicated. The cluster itself looks pretty much exactly like a cluster spanned across multiple fault domains within a region. So it's not any harder to set up really than a normal cluster, provided you have the network connectivity. It's usually these operational aspects that are trickier to really set up and manage. I'd say that if you are getting it set up and have specific questions, our issues list is a pretty good place to have those sorts of more in-depth technical discussions where we can go back and forth and figure out what's working and what's not working. But it's really going to come down to a few of those choices around, like, how do you do updates? Do you do updates, kind of roll them out across all of the different data centers or regions simultaneously? Do you try and do them in stages? Do you try to always do this region first? That sort of management aspect is where things are going to be tricky, especially in Azure, because most things in Azure can't see across regions. So OS image-based patching mechanisms are going to be per region, and there's no real way around that. Various other resources like storage and networking are going to be mostly per region. So there's no way to manage a single entity. So if you wanted to change something about the configuration of your virtual network or whatever, there's no good central single button rolling update to do that with. You kind of have to go and make decisions about how you roll that out in these different areas. So that's where the complexity comes in. I'd also just kind of say that, while we support multi-region clusters or multi-data center clusters, they're not for everybody. They're only really necessary if you need that perfect RPO and RTO where you're trying to get your recovery point objective to be as close to 0 as possible and your recovery time objective to be as close to 0 as possible, because that way it's automated, right? You want Service Fabric just failing things over and doing what we normally do. If you don't have those strict requirements, then you usually don't need multi-region clusters. The other thing that can be tricky is that we're going to require at least 3 AZs or 3 regions, and not all geopolitical legal boundaries have 3 AZs or 3 regions inside of them. That can also make it a little complicated to set up if you have that sort of restriction. In that case, you pretty much always have to go with multiple different clusters, each with their own kind of backup and restore, and practice that. And you kind of always have to do backup and restore practice anyway, because there's always the oops, right? There's always the chance that you just deleted something and you need to get back to a known good state. So I would just say before you go, too far down that route, just make sure that multi-region, multi-data center clusters are really what you need. And then if they are, that's great, that's fine. But you have to think about a few more of these operational aspects first before you're really going to get anything that meets your needs. And we're happy to help. So feel free to ask more questions if you run into, like, how do I re-centralize my logs, or how do I aggregate logs when I need them, or how do I set up, how do I choose between the VNet gateways and the new VNet peering stuff, things like that. The templates kind of show you some examples of that stuff. So I know that that's not a wholly satisfactory answer, but hopefully it gives you some things to go look at.
That's a lot of detail. Thank you. Appreciate it.
No problem.
Awesome. All right, we got one from Nick. Are there any plans to implement tell capabilities on actors similar to Akka?
No plans for that immediately. I think the best way that we're going to get something like that would probably be, I would look to porting Akka onto Service Fabric, but I don't think we would diverge from the virtual actor model that we have implemented.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, because that's the main difference between Akka and ours, is that the Akka actors are physical, right? So they have some of these major differences.
They do the kind of, I guess, traditional asynchronous message passing as the communication mechanism.
Right, they have a real inbox.
Yeah, ours is literally RPC, similar to Orleans. Although yep. Orleans has something that's a little bit closer to asynchronous. They just have some options, but ours is limited to RPC.
Mm-hmm. All right, what's next?
And Orleans, by the way, so there is a little bit of work going on to get Orleans to run a little bit better on Service Fabric too. So check that out a little bit too. Read into Orleans a little bit. It might be a bit closer to what you're looking for. If you're looking for those Akka semantics, you might want to go down that route, and then eventually that will be easier to run on Service Fabric.
Bas, do you know anything about an update on the integration web? Because I see there are some NuGet packages in release candidate quality out there for Orleans integration with Service Fabric.
I don't know what the quality is of the stuff that's out there today. I know there's work going on to improve on it, but I haven't run any of the stuff that's out there today, no.
Okay.
Another question from Andrew.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on migrating existing Windows standalone production clusters containing a whole bunch of stuff to run on Azure? Has it been done? Are there anything to plan for ahead of time? Would having the cluster be cross-region make this effort more challenging? There's no huge differences usually between moving something from on-prem up into Azure. Usually there's pretty good corollaries for most of the things that you already do on-prem in Azure. We see more problems when people want to go the other way, where they want to take their SaaS solution that runs in Azure today and start giving, a standalone version that runs on standalone for some customer. Because, in Azure you might have integrations with Stream Analytics or API management or, blob storage or things like that. And it's hard to find equivalents for those things on-prem. Usually going the other way around, it's not so hard. You can still run into problems. So like if your on-prem deployment has taken a dependency on, a big SAN, figuring out what the replacement for that is usually might require some restructuring, but it's usually not too bad. The question around if the on-prem cluster is multi-region, is it easier or harder to move into Azure? It's usually it's a little bit harder, but it's not that big a deal. It's all about the networking again. So the reason that people can usually build on-prem clusters that are multi-site pretty easy because they already have network connectivity or some physical network that spans between those regions, and they understand how to administrate it and how to get the nodes onto that network. In Azure, that's a newer feature of Azure, and so it's a little bit trickier to get multi-region network set up and configured kind of the way you want. But after that part, it's basically the same operation. So
yeah, I apologize. I think my question was more the other way around. Based off my prior question of setting up a cross-region cluster, would the migration be more challenging if that's the way we went from on-prem to a cross-region Azure cluster?
Oh, no, it shouldn't, yeah.
Yeah, it should not be any more challenging than if we're a single region. Like, if you're able to get the cluster up and running, that's where your challenges will be to get the multi-region cluster up. But if you're able to do that, then moving your stuff there is not going to cause additional problems from you being cross-regional. As Matt sort of alluded to earlier, the experience is very similar for a non-cross-regional and a multi-regional cluster. Like, the way you see it in terms of Service Fabric Explorer and the way you deploy things to it, it still behaves very much like any other Service Fabric cluster. What you did point out that was interesting was you have stateful workloads.
Yes, exactly.
So is that so one of the paths here is like you can either have two clusters that are up simultaneously and redirect traffic appropriately, and then eventually do like a backup and restore between them. Or at some point, you take a little bit of a hidden availability where you restore, or sorry, you back up everything that you have on-prem and use that to restore the stateful operation that's happening in the cluster. So you're going to have to do a little bit of a switch somehow to get that state between the operations that are on-prem and the operations that need to happen on the cluster that's actually running in Azure. So we should definitely talk about that a little bit more if that's something that's a concern for you guys.
Yeah, definitely the state was probably where I was most concerned. Obviously, we know, we might need to take some downtime, and I think that's okay. It was just a matter of would all the state be able to come over, properly. I assumed it would with backup and restore, but
yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
So basically, if you're willing to take downtime, then effectively what you're doing is you'd have the exact same application running in Standalone. You'd get that application up on Azure. You'd take a backup of the state Standalone. You'd incur a little bit of lack of availability, and you'd use the same data, the same state to restore to your application that's running in Azure. And then in the meanwhile, what you might want to also consider setting up is if this is some external-facing sort of set of APIs or website or anything, you might also want to do like a VIP swap or something like that, like in the time being to support that switch.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I'll be back. I'll be back.
So there's a question from Marcin on improved Key Vault support and any plans on improvements for Key Vault for multi-region clusters. There's nothing really to report here that I'm aware of. Key Vault remains where you have to keep the vault and the cluster that it's attached to kind of in the same region, which means that in these multi-region scenarios, you have to have a bunch of Key Vaults everywhere. That again goes back to most Azure resources are not multi-region aware. They're not really good at reaching across to other locales and interacting with things there. They're kind of namespaced per Azure region. That's something that we're working on, and there's some work going on in Azure generally to think about situations where having a global namespace for various things would be useful again. But for the most part, everything is going to be stuck per region. Even Service Fabric, technically, if you look at what you create at the end of the day, the cluster itself, the cluster resource will be stuck in one region, even though the cluster itself is really a distributed thing running across all the different regions. So technically,
I think for keyboards specifically, there is a tie-in to a hardware component in the
yes,
regions, right? So I don't know if there are plans to go beyond that because that's sort of the design around keyboard.
Right. Well, they always have to have the specific. It's the hardware storage of the keys.
Yep.
HSA, HSE, something like that. I forget.
Whatever.
That thing, that chip. But there's the kind of point is, if I can go across resource groups in Azure in a given region, why can't I go across resource groups across regions?
Yep.
And I haven't heard a good explanation specifically why that isn't possible. My bet is that there's some additional security concern where they don't want to leak the creds. My other expectation is that, again, a lot of resource names are just scoped per region, and they don't want to have the ambiguity of, is this Moss Snyder Key Vault 1 in US East or US West if I'm referring to some key inside of it, right? They have to figure out how to do that type of higher order resolution if they start letting things reach across regions.
Yep.
And that is a thing that doesn't really exist in a lot of cases today in Azure. Only very few things are multi-region.
There is one point that came through. The Skype chat is a little bit
Jumpy,
out of
but
sync.
okay.
So I just want to say, if you other guys didn't get it, that one comment that came through is that in terms of key vault, just be sure that you can outback the individual certificates and secrets that you have in key vault. So you might even have to end up with multiple key vaults anyways. It's currently limitation of key vault.
Yeah, you can RBAC you can ACL the certs once they are installed on the given machine.
Yes.
But you can't ACL them independently within Key Vault.
Exactly.
And so you end up with a whole bunch of different key vaults for small sets of keys for particular uses. Yeah.
Maybe I will describe the problem I am facing with GeoClusters, because I don't have problem with multiple key vaults. I'm perfectly okay with this one, but the problem is that I have no secure way to transfer a certificate from one key vault to another, because for normal secrets and normal keys, I can use backup and restore. If it is in the same subscription or in the same tenant, everything works perfectly. But certificates are unmovable, so I need to take certificate from the first key vault, the secret of the certificate, and copy it using some additional machine. And I don't think this is very secure. I would very much prefer to keep the key material on the key vaults and just copy the backup and restore the certificate. This is my case.
Yeah, I know we've talked with the Key Vault guys about this, but again, I think it comes down to a little bit that the multi-region scenarios are not terribly baked through yet. That is something that I know we've mentioned to them. I guess we'll have to see if that support for multi-region things gets richer in the future. But yeah, that is a painful scenario today. Absolutely.
So we've got a follow-up on an Envoy discussion we had in the earlier Q&A today. The question is whether the Envoy implementation that we're working on, or fork that we're working on, is intended to be a separate service in Azure like the App Gateway, or one that will be natively available for use with Service Fabric itself in regards to layer 7 load balancing and even such as reverse proxy.
Yeah, that's all first class in Service Fabric, so not a separate Azure service. So you'll be able to do the same thing on-prem wherever you run Service Fabric. That'll be all built in. So we're actually we're trying to get so Envoy has these discovery APIs that it uses to kind of configure itself. And what we're doing is we're building those APIs as services in Service Fabric so you can deploy Envoy, whether you use our configuration for Envoy or not. The APIs that Envoy depends on will be built into Service Fabric, so it'll all be first class.
Do you plan to support node draining and stuff like that that are natively supported by Envoy?
Yeah, we're looking into that too. Mainly, we're trying to figure out the best way to let you configure it without having to actually use the Envoy configurations themselves, because they can get pretty long after a little while. So we're just trying to see what we can expose and how. But that's one thing we're looking at. Yeah.
Okay, from Nick, now that you've open sourced some of Service Fabric, is there a reference to the full capabilities of the cluster configuration object?
I think the article that I posted here has most.
It should have all. It should always be updated for a given release. Any public supported configuration should be in that list.
Yep.
Awesome.
So it's in our docs already. Yeah. So Andrew was asking about the new Data Explorer and backup restore tools. So backup and restore tools, we're working on a backup restore service to enable you to integrate with Azure Backup. That is still the roadmap, planning to come soon. I don't know the specific release where it will actually be available. But I've still been working on. And in terms of the Data Explorer, and we also touched on this morning, it's currently the thing that we showed. I'm pretty sure this is what we showed at Ignite. That was the OData based one. Yeah. Okay. So what it is, it's actually built on this project that I just pasted a link to now, Service Fabric Curable, which is a library you can. It's an ASP.NET Core middleware. That you basically put into your or use in your reliable services. And once you do that, it exposes your reliable dictionaries as an OData endpoint. So you need to integrate this into your service to get that OData endpoint. And then we did a demonstration of how to use that in Service Fabric Explorer. Now the Service Fabric Curable is available today. The Service Fabric Explorer work is not available. It was basically just something we did for a demonstration purpose. But Service Fabric Explorer is out there and also being open source, so I mean, feel free to contribute to that in terms of consuming this OData endpoint. I think you also touched on this earlier in the earlier call today, Matt. But we want to have a more generic way of doing this than just just being able to support ASP.NET
and
Core
middleware,
scenario, but I don't think we have a specific timeline for that at this point.
No, we do want to make it more generic so that it's not bound to the ASP.NET middleware model, and we do want to make it so that it's not, it doesn't require necessarily OData, though OData is a pretty compelling model. We want it to be able to operate on offline data, so data sitting in backups, as well as live data in the cluster. So this is an area of work that is ongoing. The example that Mikkel pointed to is a pretty good start. It does require some updates to SFX as well. Locally, that is now also open source, so that's at least feasible. But that is, we understand that this is an area and that we need to do some more work and finish up some of those offerings. The OData one might be first, and then we're going to figure out the backup and restore and explorer and all that other stuff. Federated clustering question. So you have an on-prem cluster and a cloud-based cluster. Is there any ability to join them together so you can deploy services to either? Is it possible? So today, you don't really have to join them together in order to deploy things to both of them. They're both independent. So you could run the same CI/CD, copy, register, deploy, create steps on each. If you did link them together, there's nothing that stops you from doing that today. You wouldn't necessarily have two and then try and link them together. You could build one cluster that spanned anywhere, really, as long as you have the network connectivity. I mean, we don't know. Service Fabric doesn't know where you're running it, so there's nothing that stops you. The tricky bit, again, comes into kind of the management side of things. So let's say you created the cluster in Azure and then used ExpressRoute and stretched the network into your on-prem network, and then created a whole bunch of nodes with their own configuration and the right certs so that they could join back up to the cluster sitting in Azure. Now that would work, but now you have an interesting problem, which is, Azure's monthly maintenance comes along and starts trying to patch VMs, and it can only patch some of the VMs. It can't patch these ones on-prem because it doesn't know about them. They don't exist anywhere. You start getting weird tears between what shows up in Explorer in the portal, because portal is showing you the VM scale set VMs, whereas in SFX you're going to see all of the nodes, which includes your on-prem stuff. You're going to have weird configurations around where storage of your logs is and things like that. So really, when we see these things set up, there's a lot of work that goes in up front to figuring out kind of who owns the cluster. Is the cluster built on-prem or extended into Azure, or is it built in Azure and occasionally stretches into on-prem? Is it living in 3 or 5 regions all up front? All that type of stuff, kind of we see people want to puzzle that out first. I've only ever seen one cluster that spanned between on-prem and Azure, and it was mainly for a burst scenario, where occasionally some additional VMs would get provisioned as IaaS in Azure,
yeah,
and then hooked up by ExpressRoute to an on-prem cluster.
So basically what you would do in that scenario is you wouldn't use what we call the Service Fabric Resource Provider, or SFRP, to create an Azure cluster.
Right.
You would basically just provision a bunch of VMs and
as if they're your
install
own
Service Fabric on top of that as a standalone installation.
Yep, as if they're
Then
their
you
own.
don't get into the
Who manages what, and who's in charge.
Exactly.
Kind of
The VMs are all yours. There isn't this managed service fabric there.
So,
but again, the benefits of doing the federation, I mean, it's just you get a unified management point, at least from a service
I only
fabric
have
point
to
of
do
view.
one upgrade. I don't have to do 2 upgrades, or
Exactly.
3 upgrades, or 5 upgrades.
But so that's one of them. The other thing is that if you want to run stateful services across, right, you need to either have it being one cluster in order to have Service Fabric doing the data replication for you, or you would have to build your own data replication if it's 2 clusters. There is no concept of replicating cross clusters from Service Fabric's side. So those are basically your options, and depending on what you're after in terms of federation, there are
If you have a
different
cross-spanning
models.
cluster, the state is automatically replicated. If the cluster is spanning on-prem in Azure, state would get replicated.
Everything else is
based on
normal.
placement or whatever you do, you can do that. Yeah. The cluster really doesn't know where it is.
Yeah.
In that sense.
The cluster just knows I have network connectivity and operating system instances and some local storage. That's all it really needs.
Yeah.
It doesn't know whether or not those are physical, virtual machines, if they're running in Azure, AWS, on-prem, whatever.
What?
Yeah. That's a thing.
That's it, definitely a thing.
That's a thing. Stateful services wise required to both overall number of partitions and partitions key function. It looks redundant as the number of partitions could be improved for the partition function.
If you don't get this, I was gonna ask Flo to open the mic, because I don't.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm getting it, but basically the way we think of partitioning is that there's a key space, which is some number of keys, say long min to long max or int min to int max, and then there's some number of actual physical partitions that all those keys are divided into. So if you had 100 keys, 0 to 99, and you had 10 partitions, right? The first partition would get 0 to 9, and then 10 to 19, and then 20 to 29. And that's kind of the thing. The partition key space gets mapped down into this certain number of partitions. So they could be one-to-one. You could have 100 keys and 100 partitions. In that case, sure, technically you only need one piece of information. But usually we see this multiple thing because people, I come along with some user ID, and there's 1,000 different user IDs, but I want 10 of them to live in one partition, right? Or I've got an entire phone book, but I've only got 3 partitions, and I'm going to do some hashing that gets me from, first letter of last name to which bucket you actually land into. So it's something like that. I hope that I hope that answers your question, and let us know if you have more questions or I didn't quite get it right.
I think you did.
You gotta thank you.
You gotta thank you.
Okay, cool.
And it makes sense. So that's good.
Better than usual.
That's unusual.
Yeah. Okay. So Marcin asks, least duration across fault domains. In case of nested fault domains, yeah, it bases it on the top level fault domain. So Canada Central 1 and 2, those would be in the same fault domain, and so you'd get the regular least duration. Whereas if you had Canada Central 1 and US East 1, those would be different, and you'd get the other least duration.
Awesome. This is, I hope that it works.
Yeah. It works the way that makes sense. Once in a while, we get one right. There's a question on...
So Nick is asking about the data explorer we're able to query actors. Not, well, the curable library, which is the, let's say, the server-side part of this, would not, because it's simply just, it has to sit in an ASP.NET Core service today. So, but you could, if you could have that service, query your actors for data, you could definitely end up doing it that way.
Yeah, again, this is one of the things about the current implementation, that example, is that it's OData HTTP operating directly against a dictionary-based state manager. And
in the service where the OData
is. In the service with the actual data.
Yeah.
And so, in all those cases, that doesn't really map to actors, right? Actors have RPC, not HTTP. They don't have quite the same state management thing, right? It's different. So you could follow roughly the same pattern where you could have a proxy or something like that that's speaking HTTP OData and have that go and query the actors for you. But in terms of getting the data out of actors, you're going to have to do something kind of different. So you could extend it. I'm not entirely sure what that would look like today, but it's all just code. So, yeah, that's the quote. Yeah, I want to put it up. It's all just code. It's all just code.
I'm going to put it up.
Okay. So you just want to write on the board.
I just want to write on the board.
So question. I added diagnostic extensions to my scale sets. I successfully got my data in my storage account and created it from OSS. Cool. It was tough to find my custom health events that came through as a health report. Is there a way to send more information from Service Fabric to be able to query my custom health events better in OMS? I know there is, and Deep, who left, unfortunately, would be the guy to answer this.
Okay, so Deep is coming back.
Oh, great. Right, so maybe we'll come back to this one.
Yeah, let's come back to that one.
Because I can make some stuff up, but he's probably going to be able to actually answer. Think back to a question from last year. Now that you're open sourcing Service Fabric, does it mean you finally get a peek at how you implemented your perfect failure detection? Yeah, and Marcin already found it for you. So go peek in there. It's a lot of C++, so good luck. It's also C++ that kind of has to run in the Windows kernel, so that's bonus fun. So it looks a little weird in places, but That one is actually fairly well commented. It's better than most because we have to remember how it works when we go stare at it once in a while. So that one helps. But yeah,
Who worked on the failure detection?
failure detection was Lou for the most part. Perhaps unsurprising.
No, it's
Yeah.
not surprising. We should really do like features. Like,
Yeah.
take synthesis and just like feature Lou and.
Well, I think we had a.
Oh, sorry. We don't have any more questions right before we start talking.
No, I mean, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. We should.
You were saying something?
I think I don't know if you asked. Did you put that out? I think, but there's been talk about doing some like. Let's look at the source code now. It's open source, the video sessions, things,
Yeah, we should do
whiteboard
that.
stuff.
Yeah, we think
Whiteboard
that's something.
sessions.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of what we want to get to. Those will come out over time, but we want to start recording these just kind of one-on-one whiteboard sessions where we talk about different areas of the system and how it works. Hopefully publish some white papers as well, but sometimes you just have to have someone on a whiteboard explaining how certain parts work. So we'd love to get some of those recorded eventually.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be good.
That'd be awesome.
It's all just-
KTL logger is much more difficult because it is spread across all the source trees. So
Yeah,
this one would require, I would really appreciate some documentation and explanation, but you have already described most, I think.
Yeah, KTL logger is a gnarly one because it's conceptually one component that's actually about 4 components, and figuring out how they all interact with each other is a little bit crazy. The least layer is conceptually simpler, but the code is pretty clever, so it can get interesting. Another neat one is
they go together, right?
the cluster resource manager is another gnarly piece of code that's in underneath reliability, and then load balancer is the cluster resource manager. That's another large chunk of code that's spread all over the place. That's also pretty neat. All sorts of things. But yeah, we do want to have better documentation around what all these different components are, and if we can have those sorts of tutorials and have people lead you through it. We just haven't had a chance to record too many of them yet. So that's something we want to get to. So perfect time.
Yeah.
What's up? We have a question for you.
It says NP hard problem. I don't know if I could solve
No,
that.
yours is back up a little early.
I see.
So the question from earlier was somebody added diagnostics to their, a bunch of diagnostic extensions and scale sets and got everything plumbing through OMS.
Yes.
But they added some custom health reports, and those they had to like really dig in the OMS data to see if they could find their health reports.
Yeah.
And they were wondering, is there a way to
Query
or be more explicit about what data is getting sent, including things like custom health reports from their services to OMS, and get a way to kind of have it sync up so it's easier to, like, I wrote this string here, I can clearly see it in OMS here.
Yeah.
So
So
that makes sense.
yeah, it does make sense. So first question is they are getting stuff in OMS. The health reports are showing up, right?
Yeah.
So today the way health reports show up is they come up with a task name of HM, which effectively means the health manager in Service Fabric is writing out that health report. So you should be able to filter either using queries or using log analytics' little UI that says show me only stuff that's coming out of HM. Now that will show you every single health report, not just your custom health reports. Today there is no way to disambiguate between those two things. The way that you do that is there's a field in the health report which is of type message, either message or event message, and that's where your string would actually go. So there are 2 paths here. One is you can write a complex query that parses that entire event message and looks for this specific substring content. Or OMS has this notion of a custom field type where effectively you can set up like regex in OMX to say parse this particular field in a specific way each time that you see it. So you could effectively find, you could embed in your health message saying, I am writing this health message, and then copy and highlight and say, everywhere that you see I am writing this health message, create that as a custom field, and OMS will sort that as the data comes in and will make that into a queryable field, which then becomes way easier to alert on or way easier to query in the future. So that would be the path that I recommend. Bear in mind that in a few releases, we're also looking at improving and changing this pipeline a little bit about how the health events will actually show up. And when the new stuff comes in, you may have to modify stuff a little bit, but it will generally be the same if you go via like this custom field implementation.
Question is, any plans to expand upon the reliable collections, like enhancing the existing collections or adding new types? Yeah, I mean, there's always work that we're doing here. Some of the things that we kind of want to do is get better support for things like queries or indexing. See if that's something that we can build into the collections natively. Other things that we're trying to see if we can do are to get better control over things like the in-memory kind of caching of the collections. Today, the collections try to keep almost everything in memory and flush out things when they're under some pressure, flush out things that haven't been used in a while. But that's all kind of black magic, and there's no great control that you can set at the user level. That's something that we want to make a little bit more explicit. And then kind of the last area that we're looking at enhancing is getting clearer about whether or not the collections are persisted to disk, whether or not persistence is optional, whether they're only in memory, whether they're only on disk, getting all of those different options plumbed through there. That's the majority of the stuff that we're looking at doing in terms of the collections right now. That should keep us busy for a little while, getting all those different options tuned in there. Yeah, I think that's most of the stuff that I can think of that's coming in, that's already being kind of thought about and worked on. We do want to make it easier to write new collections.
Yeah,
right?
we're also working on a way to write simpler.
Yeah. Right now, implementing a custom collection is a science fair project, and it isn't terribly easy, especially if you wanted to make one that was going to interoperate with the existing ones. So we're going to also go back and kind of scrub through those APIs and see if we can make a cleaner or simpler set of APIs, so that writing new collections types, you want a replicated transactional red-black tree or something. I don't know, pick something. Yeah, a nice simple one, right? Deep cut CS class PTSD.
Yeah, PTSD.
Yeah. Or a list. Yeah, that's probably a better answer. Say you wanted a reliable list. Yeah, for example. That's a great answer. I should remember that. How do you write one of those? How do you get it into the existing set of collections? How does it interoperate with the rest? Today, that's hard, and you have to kind of layer it on top of the existing collections. We want to give you lower level access with cleaner APIs so that you can write these other collections easily. Yeah. And that is something that we want to do. We did add reliable concurrent queue. That was a few months ago, I guess, probably a year ago, I guess. Dear God, time.
So that's not available in Java. It's coming.
Oh, that's another thing.
Yeah. It's not available.
I guess that's another aspect of the thing that we're doing right now is getting all of this consistent between Java and C#.
Yeah. And then also with the simple stuff that's coming out just across like all languages where you can
improve programming levels.
Yeah, trying to light up other programming languages.
Yes.
All right.
So another question was on elastic scale. Is there anything coming around to make service fabric scale based on traffic, memory consumption, and whatnot? So
I like the whatnot.
Yeah. So we can definitely scale on
We can
whatnot.
actually implement a whatnot.
Yeah. Now, so I'll tease something apart here, which is there's the difference between scaling Service Fabric and scaling the workloads on top of Service Fabric. Scaling Service Fabric is mainly about adding more nodes, and that works pretty well today based on Azure Autoscale, where you can say, hey, if these machines are full in terms of memory or CPU, then just add more machines, and those will join into the cluster, and Service Fabric will distribute the workloads automatically. So that part's not too bad. For stateless services, we are adding scaling features where you're going to have the notion of kind of a trigger, which you can say, look at this metric, which is the general Service Fabric cluster resource manager notion of a metric, and see if it's, average load for this service is over some amount for some time. And if you see that, you can add more instances to this stateless service. So you're going to have a trigger, and a mechanism, right? So the trigger would be average service load, and the mechanism would be add more instances to the service. And then we'll add more as we go on. So maybe it's average load of a given partition, or maybe it's average load of all of these services in an application. And then there might be a bunch of different mechanisms, like instead of creating and deleting service instances, maybe you want to create a whole new named service, or maybe you want to add or remove partitions, some things like that. There's also work going on for stateful services around repartitioning, where we're going to dynamically change the number of partitions on the fly. That's still being worked out because it really changes how you have to structure your data, right? If you had a dictionary with 1,000 rows in it, I can't just draw a line down the middle, right, and pick, right, which ones go where. So we're going to have to change the API a little bit in order to make that actually work pretty well. But that's something else that we're looking into. We're doing some of the work already kind of at the lower levels to enable that, but it will be a while before it shows up at the actual higher layers. But yeah, there is a lot of stuff that's on the way here. The stateless stuff will probably show up first. API versioning question?
Yeah, so basically you want to pass API version in the header, and you have to service 5 reverse proxy based on header information.
Yeah, hey Voss?
Is that API, so if it's API version of like the Service Fabric APIs for management, that's all in the query string if you're using the HTTP APIs. If it's API versions of your own services, we don't really know anything about that. There is the reverse proxy, we're adding the ability to pass parameters through headers instead of the query string, but that's stuff for service resolution. So the partition key, the replica selector, those kinds of things. But we don't really know anything about your APIs, so I don't think you'd be able to do that. We do have in the service mesh, we'll have a way to switch between versions of your services. So you can route traffic to different versions, and you can assign weights to those versions. So you can say, for example, I want to route 25% of all traffic to V2 and 75% to V1 or something like that. It's still not quite at the API level because, again, we don't know what your API is, but we can route it by version. So if you tag or if you match up your version, your API versions with the service version, then yeah, that'll kind of get what you want. That's not necessarily the reverse proxy. The reverse proxy isn't going to have something like that, but the mesh is sort of the successor to that, and that's where you'll see that functionality.
Yep. In the meantime today, could you do it in something like API management?
I'd have to think about it. I don't know if you could really, because it's still just the same resolution mechanism.
Yeah.
So again, the only thing you'd be able to do really is if you can examine the HTTP request in API management, and if you have some header to look out for, then based on that header you can route the traffic yourself to a different version of your service. It would be a different name of the service though, so it wouldn't necessarily be a different version of the same service instance. So it would be a little weird, but you could pull something off.
Yeah.
So you're saying it's there's just a comment that it's on-prem. Oh, I guess there was a relation
Yeah,
to the API.
yeah, so API management.
But the service mesh stuff, Vas, is going to be Service Fabric runtime based, right? So we'll work on-prem as well?
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, that's, again, like I said, that's all first-class stuff in Service Fabric. So anywhere you run Service Fabric on-prem or whatever, you'll have a mesh there.
And eventually, will that also be able to take care of ingress?
Mm-hmm. Actually, the other way around. So ingress will come first, and then the full service mesh will come later.
Okay, cool. So that will basically substitute the reverse proxy.
In the end, that will be a substitute to the reverse proxy. Once the full service mesh is built out, there really shouldn't be a reason to use the reverse proxy after that.
Flo says, yeah, it's a lot of work to do a bunch of operations across all the partitions and the collections, and without rewriting Spark, yes, that would be a lot of work as well. Do we have any plans to make querying across partitions a bit easier? No, not specifically, but there's architectures that solve this problem a little bit differently, depending on how consistent you need that query to be. Normally, we see people put a service either in front of the service that's storing all the actual data or behind it. If you put it in front, the updates or whatever flow into that service and then get stored in whatever little partition that you actually have. And that service that's in the front is, looking at metadata or building those stats that you need or building that index. And then the data flows into the actual place where it's stored. That gives the service, you can ask that service these types of questions, like give me the view of the top 5 things. It could keep that and pass everything else through. That's if you want that data to be perfect. If you don't need the data to be perfect, then you can kind of build it as an aggregator on the other end, where every so often it visits all of the existing services and pulls the data out of them and crunches all these different stats and views. That will inherently be slow. I mean, it'll be slower in the sense that the data will show up later, and it will be less consistent because it sees things at different times, whereas the other one's an intermediary and it's all going through. That's still a lot of work, but it kind of gets more to this microservices pattern where everything has a specific duty. The other thing is, this is only usually necessary for ad hoc questions that you need to answer kind of like right now. If you don't need to answer right now, like if you're good with last month's data, you can always just take the data from the collections and have them periodically write themselves out to something like Cosmos or a SQL data warehouse or anything like that. And then you can do those queries, those kind of ad hoc, massive, show me last month's sales data questions from there. That's going to be a better tool for that type of job in a lot of cases where you need that global view back, right? So you're making a trade-off between performance and storage and whatever you can do kind of per operation in the cluster, and then these ad hoc, long-running kind of data warehouse auditing thing. Yeah, auditing is exactly the right word. Things in the sort of backing story in a cold storage where things are exhausted periodically. That really helps separate out those concerns, so you're not writing a ton of code in the front end just to handle these queries. And you don't have to go visit everybody all the time. You just have them periodically write things out. It's a different architecture because you have, kind of your hot, mutable, constantly rotating state in the cluster, and your colder stuff is in some other data warehouse. But, that's the right tool for the job, right? When the requests are coming in and they're getting processed, that's the hot state in the cluster, and then the last month's sales or whatever the aggregation phase is can happen in a cold store behind the scenes more periodically. We've seen it solved both ways, where people either write the code because they need it to be perfectly consistent and hot, and we've seen people write the data dump version because they don't actually care about that. So either way, there's ways to solve it, but we're not at this point going to build like a generic visitor or anything like that.
Okay, time check. We're heading into the lightning round.
5,
We got
10
about
minutes lightning round.
8 minutes left.
There was a question about performance issues with reverse proxy. I don't have anything specific to recommend to look for, but I want to just highlight a few articles on how you can do diagnostics with the reverse proxy and really get some deep insights into what's going on, as well the kind of configurations that you have. There are different settings in the reverse proxy that you can start tweaking. You can start tweak along the way once you do this diagnostic to see where these things hang. So I think that's the best advice I can give at this point.
Yeah. And meanwhile, Marcin has found our simulated annealing algorithms in the searcher and all sorts of other fun stuff. There is lots of fun stuff in this code base, guys.
This is a highly disproportionate amount of winky faces and like the space in the chat box, like on the left. If you look on your laptop, it's just like 6 of them just winking at you at the same time.
I turned off all of those emoticons because it made me twitchy.
Yeah, this is really weird.
But,
Marcin, I blame you completely.
But yes, there's lots of cool stuff in the code base, and we will do a better job of explaining it sooner or later.
Someone needed us both for puppetry.
Yeah.
Yes.
Please take Mark's survey when you get a chance. We appreciate that.
Oh, that's the reference.
Yeah.
I got it.
Number 3 in the survey.
Yes.
What is that question?
What's
I don't know,
question
look at
3?
the survey.
Look at the survey.
But thanks everyone for taking it. Okay, 6 minutes.
Are we just going to skip over Charles?
Can you address Charles's question?
Oh,
yeah.
skip over
So Charles was talking about my secret effort to rewrite the entire FM in Python.
Hmm.
Charles, I've run into a few issues, but I've also been strictly informed that this is not PM work and that I should loop my dev back in, which is this guy named Charles Torre. I think he's going to be doing it, so you should just sync up with that guy and make sure he's getting stuff done on time.
I thought you were doing the JavaScript version.
You can take it up with Charles now. It's you know.
So Charles is doing the JavaScript version.
Honestly, boss, we thought about it for a bunch, and I think Python's just a better user experience. And given that that's the case, we decided to prioritize that first.
Given the fact that Python is now more popular than C# according to the latest Stack
Oh, is that true?
Developer
See,
survey,
you're heading in the right direction, Charles. Well done.
I think that's a good thing. Even though JavaScript is still the most popular.
I think Angular was the most popular, so I'm going to try to rewrite it in Angular.
You can build anything in JavaScript.
Well, boss, we've also decided that, we can't keep up with JavaScript. Every day you look and there's like just a whole new framework and a new approach for doing things that it ages me so fast that I just couldn't be bothered.
I actually have a
0 days without a new JavaScript.
Yeah, there we go. We have that up on our window now, boss.
Yeah, and you don't even have
right.
to make the 0 be a 2. Yeah, it's just print it.
I do second Charles' second request though,
Yes.
which is to get Matt to stand up and shout.
That's not a thing I say. That's not like a catchphrase that I have.
That was so funny.
That's great though. Can you do it?
No.
Alright, let the bidding begin.
I know, I'm such a killjoy.
Everybody send a thumb in chat if you'd like to see that.
Let's see if you tune into the next Q&A, which is a month from now, third Thursday of each month. Let's see if we've persuaded Matt to be able to do that then.
We've got 3,
on my cold heart.
4, 5, 6
How do
thumbs.
you do a thumb? How do you do a thumb?
Okay, wait a minute.
That's a great question.
There's some education
Well,
on
you can see
something.
if you do it right.
A Y without spaces.
Oh, there you
All
go.
right, and we're
Copy paste.
flying past Andrew's
Okay.
question.
Anyway.
Yeah, I didn't quite catch the
That was
roadmap
actually a question?
for backup restore earlier. So the situation with backup and restore is that we're building a backup restore service into the cluster that handles the scheduling part of backup. So instead of having to write code that like sleeps for a while, wakes up, takes a backup, and stashes it somewhere, you'll be able to say to the service, hey, every 5 minutes take an incremental backup of all my services, and then stash it in this blob storage account. And when you've got 10 incremental backups, collapse all of them, take a full backup, and delete them, and do this sort of mechanical management. I will caution that this service is not a panacea, right? It's not magic. The thing about backup and restore in Service Fabric is that it will always be per partition, right? It's not one big static system image where you're somehow freezing the reads and writes on all nodes, taking one big consistent snapshot across everything and taking a big backup. It's going to always be kind of per partition, which means that things are going to get torn, you're going to have services in different states, and you're really going to have to practice and exercise that restore path to make sure that once you do a restore, that your services, if they're communicating, if they're exchanging information at all, can get back in sync with each other. That's always the hardest part. Taking the backup isn't actually too hard. It's a lot of boilerplate code that you have to write, and that's why we're doing the backup and restore service to help you out of having to write all that stuff.
So with that service, you don't have to write.
You don't have to write any code to do the backup, and you don't have to write any code to do these schedules, and you don't have to go enumerate your partitions. You can just say all this stuff is declarative, more or less. But the restore part is the hard part, and that's the part that you're going to need to practice, because we see situations all the time where people, I have service A that generates a number and then sends it to service 2, and the problem is that service 2 gets a backup at a time when it has the key that service 1 sent it, but service 1 get backed up before it ever did that, and so they're getting backed up kind of leapfrogging each other like that. And so when you do the restore, service 2 has a key that service 1 doesn't remember generating and sending to it. They have to reconcile this stuff. That's always the hard part.
So are you exposing finally the epoch information?
I think it's there today inside the backup and restore records. So part of the thing that we're going to have to do is when we talk about those data viewers that let you go and muck around in the backups that you've taken, it definitely has to expose that information because you want to be able to see exactly where things were. But the epoch information is still per partition. It's not a global thing. So you're still only really timestamping the sequence of events in this partition.
For my
And-
cases, it is more than enough. I just need to synchronize the services that are basing on a single tenant or single partition. So
Right.
I just need an epoch for one epoch number. It's
Right.
just enough.
Yes. So that should be enough. I know that it's in the data today. We haven't put it in. So it's in the data when we saved it because we have to do all this stuff automatically in the collections, but it's not exposed today in a way that you can read it easily. So that's all something we're going to have to fix. But yeah, the backup and restore service will help with some of this, but that restore process and that reconciliation is really the tricky part. So I encourage people to exercise that path in their code anyway, because the backup and restore service will help you get there, but it will not fix that consistency cross-service part for you. You're going to have to figure that part out and what it means for these two services to kind of talk to each other and reconcile stuff.
So the last question about an idea of topics and schedule for presenting a build. Yes, we have ideas of what the topics are. We will not tell you.
Yes.
We'll tell you soon. Yeah.
So at any time when we get closer,
I think once you get more like clear
Certainty
around it,
certainty
yeah. Certainty
of-
around
some
it.
things will not be told until we are at build.
That is true. That is also correct.
But expect us to be there, and expect us, if you're there,
Yeah.
to by and say hi.
And
we're gonna have a
For anybody who doesn't know what Build is, it's a conference in the first week of May,
Yep.
more or less.
Correct.
So look for announcements and things around then. Regardless if you're there or not, usually parts of it are streamed and
I think
things like
it's
that.
And recorded.
Yeah, so it's all available sooner or later.
Yeah.
But yeah, there should be some neat.
We should do our own
announcements.
live stream from a little booth area.
Oh
We
yeah.
could do that. Charles, are you still there?
Yeah, Charles,
I
I
just
just
signed you
good
up for
idea
that.
for you.
By the way.
You can host a stream on a service fabric cluster.
Yeah.
Spend time on a service fabric.
Cool.
That's it, guys. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks everybody.
Thank you guys.
Have a good
Oh,
rest of your
and,
day.
Oh, poor Andrew.